According to a 2025 report by the Pew Research Center, 95% of people in Turkey identify as Muslim. But that number can be misleading. It glosses over some of the country's rich internal diversity, especially when it comes to groups that don't fit neatly into Sunni or Shia categories. One of the most significant of these groups in the Turkish religious landscape doesn't worship in mosques. Their services don't follow the 5 daily prayers. Their rituals involve sacred music, dance, and communal meals. And while they do revere the Prophet Muhammad's family, many don't consider themselves Muslim at all. They're called Alevis. Throughout Turkey's history, Alevis have often remained on the margins, frequently misunderstood, underrepresented, and at times subjected to discrimination. But in recent decades, they've become one of the most visible non-Sunni groups in the country. They've built cultural centers, launched TV stations, and taken their place in political debates about religion, secularism, and identity. But if you were to ask 10 Alevis what Alevism is, you might get 10 different answers. Is it a branch of Islam like Shiism or Sunnism, a mystical tradition with Sufi roots, or a distinct religion in its own right? In this video, we're going to explore the history, beliefs, and practices of the Alevis. We'll look at how this tradition emerged, its place in Turkish society, and how Alevis navigate the complexities of modern Turkey and the wider world. At the most basic level, Alevism is a religious tradition expressed in an Islamic framework, often described as a syncretic form of Islam that blends elements of Shiism, Sufism, and local folk beliefs from Anatolia. But as we'll see later in this video, that definition is debated even among Alevis themselves. One thing is clear, Alevis are not a single homogeneous group. Despite the name suggesting a unified identity, Alevism is actually a broad umbrella term that includes several heterogeneous communities with distinct practices, beliefs, and histories. What often unites them is not a shared doctrine or a singular tradition, but rather a common identity as Alevis that is frequently defined in contrast to Sunni Islam, which is the majority religious population in Turkey. Alevis make up an estimated 15 to 20% of Turkey's population, though smaller Alevi communities do exist in former Ottoman territories like Bulgaria, Iraq, and Syria. But even within Turkey, Alevis don't all speak the same language or belong to the same ethnic group. Around 2/3 of Alevis speak Turkish, while the remaining third belong to Kurdish communities, speaking either Kurmanji, a dialect of Kurdish, or the closely related language Zaza. Another quick clarification, there's another group in Turkey that sometimes gets grouped in with the Alevis called the Alawites. Alawites are a religious minority that branched off from Shia Islam centuries ago. Most of them live in Syria, where they make up a significant part of the population. But there's also a sizable Alawite population in Turkey, particularly in the southern province of Hatay near the Syrian border. In Turkish, they're sometimes called Arap Alevis, or Arab Alevis, though they're technically a different ethno-religious group. Part of the confusion comes from the fact that the term Alevi itself is inherited from the Arabic word Alawi. So both the word Alevi and Alawite have the same etymology, both describing communities with a shared reverence for Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. But despite the similar names and the shared reverence for Ali, Alawites, or Arab Alevis, follow a different set of beliefs and practices compared to Anadolu Alevis, or Anatolian Alevis, who we're focusing on in this video. Alawites are a whole separate topic, and we'll cover them in a whole separate video. So if Alevis are so diverse, what actually unites them under the same label? If there's no systematized theology shared by all Alevi communities and no single defining characteristic, what makes Alevis Alevis? Let's start with the name Alevi, which, as I mentioned, comes from the name Ali. Ali was the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, and the 4th person to take on the role of caliph after Muhammad's death. The term caliph comes from the Arabic khalifa, meaning successor or regent, and refers to the person chosen to lead the Muslim community after the Prophet's death, not as a prophet himself, but as a political and religious leader. But from the very beginning, there was fierce debate over who should fill that role. Should it be someone with close blood ties to Muhammad, like Ali, or someone chosen for their leadership and seniority? His supporters, known as the partisans of Ali, or Shiat Ali in Arabic, believed that he was the rightful successor to Muhammad, while others believed it should be Abu Bakr, an elder statesman and the Prophet's father-in-law. This disagreement over who should lead the Muslim community sparked a major schism and eventually gave rise to the 2 major branches, Sunni and Shia Islam. Now, the relationship between Alevism and Shia Islam is very complicated, and I'll cover that in a bit. But in the broadest sense, Alevism shares a lot of Shia sensibilities when it comes to honoring Ali and his family. Ali's image appears in nearly every Alevi place of worship, and his name is woven into the songs and poetry sung at gatherings. For many Alevis, Ali is both the ideal human and the mirror of the divine. They admire him as a righteous leader, but also many revere him as something much more, a kind of cosmic figure. One Alevi poem describes him as the first and the last of this world, Shah, who is the Sultan of the universe. I wander around in every corner of the world. I never saw any other man than Ali. Some view him and Muhammad as emanations of the divine light. An Alevi saying even merges him with Muhammad, which says Ali is Muhammad, Muhammad is Ali. Alevis also believe that their religious leaders, known as Dedes or grandfathers, are literal blood descendants of Ali, tracing their lineage through what are called the 12 Imams of Shia Islam. The 12 Imams are descendants of Ali, who are believed to have inherited the imamate, or the spiritual and political authority of Muhammad, culminating in the mysterious disappearance of the 12th Imam in 941 CE. So for Alevis, Dedes are not just teachers, they are the living heirs of sacred knowledge. Their authority is seen as both inherited and divinely sanctioned. In this way, Dedes form a kind of spiritual aristocracy, holding a unique role as the legitimate custodians of the Prophet's revelation, not just through instruction and book learning, but through literal bloodline through Ali. So by now, if you know a thing or two about Shia Islam, you might already be wondering, so are Alevis basically Shi'i Muslims? It's a fair question. After all, Alevis deeply revere Ali and the family of the Prophet, just like Shi'i Muslims do. Alevis also honor the same 12 Imams that are central to Twelver Shi'ism, the dominant form of Shia Islam in places like Iran and Iraq. Alevis also believe in one God, and most recognize the Quran as sacred scriptures. So understood in the very broadest sense, Alevis do demonstrate many Shi'i characteristics, but labeling them strictly as Shi'i Muslims is misleading. And the very fact that we're asking this question just reveals how our religious categories often fail when applied to pluralistic traditions like Alevism. First of all, Alevis don't follow Shi'i law, and they don't consider Shi'i clerics as religious authorities. And that distinction becomes very clear when we look at what Twelver Shi'ism looks like today. In Twelver Shi'ism, trained clerics hold significant religious authority and are tasked with interpreting Islamic law based on the Quran and Hadith, that is, the collections of sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and the Imams. Alevis, by contrast, don't follow this system of jurisprudence at all. Their religious leaders, the Dedes, function more like Sufi leaders than Shi'i legal scholars. They have no tradition of following a marja, or supreme legal authority, as Twelvers do, nor do Alevis use Shi'i hadith collections. Instead, Alevism is largely an oral tradition, and even the texts that are unique to Alevism don't really overlap with Shia Islam in any meaningful way. Alevis do have their own body of texts called Buyruk, which means instructions or rules, attributed to the Imam Jafar, the sixth Imam according to Twelver Shi'ism. These writings lay out Alevi beliefs and practices, but they're much closer to Sufi thought than mainstream Shi'i theology. They're written in Turkish, not Arabic, and they operate entirely outside the tradition of hadith literature, which is so central to Islamic orthodoxy. So in that sense, Alevism carves out its own theological and scriptural space, separate from both Sunni and Shia frameworks. And more to the point, Alevis outright reject the label. They do not see themselves as Shi'i Muslims, though many of them do consider themselves to be Muslim. So yes, Alevism does share some theological terrain with Shia Islam, especially its reverence for Ali and the 12 Imams. And an Alevi might be intrigued to visit holy sites important to Shi'i Muslims, like Karbala or Najaf in Iraq. But Alevism is a distinct tradition with its own practices, its own texts, and its own worldview. A tradition shaped around the figure of Ali, but not bound to Shi'i jurisprudence or clerical authority. So if Alevism does not fit neatly into Shia or Sunni Islam, what does it emphasize? This is where Sufism comes in. Sufism is the mystical dimension of Islam. It's not exactly a branch or denomination, but more like a spiritual orientation or a set of practices that can exist within both Sunni and Shia traditions, oriented toward mysticism. Alevis are not part of a formal Sufi order, but their tradition has been deeply shaped by Sufi thought and sensibilities. One of the core ideas that Alevis share with Sunni Sufi thought comes from the teachings of the Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi, called the unity of existence. This is a Sufi metaphysical doctrine holding that God is identical with existence itself, and that all created things exist only through this singular divine reality. This means that the divine is not all that distant, but is fully present in the everyday material world. In Alevi belief, this reinforces the idea that spiritual truth is not just found in mosques or rituals, it's woven into all aspects of life, nature, and human relationships. Like many Islamic mystical traditions, Alevis also distinguish between the zahir, or the exoteric, or the outward aspects of religion, and the batin, the esoteric, the hidden meaning. But in Alevism, the esoteric takes center stage. One of the best illustrations of this emphasis and a key Sufi element of Alevi cosmology is the doctrine of the Durt Kappa, or the Four Gates. A person's religious journey to approach God must pass through 4 successive stages. The first is Shariat, or Sharia. This is the entry point, the outer layer of religion. From the Alevi perspective, this is typically seen as Islam as practiced by many Sunnis today. Prayer, fasting, giving alms. Alevis often see these as legitimate methods to prepare oneself to approach God, but they're also seen as rudimentary methods at best. The second stage is Tariqat, the path. The term tariqah itself comes from Sufi terminology, where it refers to the spiritual path a disciple follows under the guidance of a Sufi leader. In classical Sufism, each tariqat is a distinct order, like the famous Mevlevis, each with its own rituals and lineage. While Alevis are not part of a formal Sufi order, their use of the term reflects a similar idea: spiritual training guided by a living teacher, with the goal of transforming the self and progressing toward the divine. At this stage, the seeker is initiated into the tradition. They learn the rituals, symbols, and moral codes of Alevism, often under the guidance of a Dede. The third stage is Marifet. Marifet comes from an Arabic word that can be translated as gnosis, or inner knowledge. In Sufi thought, it refers to a deep intuitive understanding, something that's beyond intellectual knowledge. Sure, you can gain knowledge through books and formal study, but marifet is acquired through spiritual experience, reflection, and purification of the self. It's considered a gift granted to the seeker who has traversed the earlier stages of the path. In the Alevi context, the third gate marks the point where a person begins to perceive the hidden esoteric truths of existence, guided by insight rather than external religious law. The seeker starts to develop intuitive spiritual insight as a result of their journey. Then there's the final stage, hakikat. Here, all separation between the self and God dissolves. The person becomes one with God, sometimes called hak, or divine truth. This four-stage model reflects the heart of Alevi spirituality and practice. Religion is a transformative process. Ask an Alevi to sum up the tradition and you might hear the phrase Eline, Diline, Beline, Sahibo, which means restrain your hands, tongue, and loins. In other words, Alevism is fundamentally about ethical self-discipline and living a moral life. This perspective has concrete effects on how Alevis treat the Quran and Islamic ritual practice. Most Alevis do respect the Quran as a holy book, but they believe the Quran's true message is hidden in allegory and can only be understood with guidance from spiritual leaders and through inspiration. Many Alevis hold that over history, the Quran's apparent meaning was distorted by those in power, and that only Ali and his descendants preserved its authentic esoteric interpretation. Islamic Sharia law only plays a marginal role, and religious obligations like daily prayer are not emphasized in the same way that they are in Sunni or Shia Islam. As the anthropologist David Shanklin observes, the great majority of Alevis do not regard daily prayer, going to Mecca, fasting in Ramadan, or paying alms to be required for religious fulfillment. Instead, they see these obligations as only the first gate to God, a stage that one might outgrow on the spiritual path. In fact, rejecting these formal practices is sometimes a point of pride. Alevis are sometimes criticized for not performing the 5 daily prayers, but many would defend themselves by pointing to a different understanding of what it means to live a religious life. In their view, true devotion is not about the exoteric, the zahir, but the esoteric, the batin. Alevis often dismiss their critics as those who remain on the surface of Islam, but who fail to grasp the deeper meaning behind an act or a ritual. So the Alevi path to God is conceptualized as a path of ethical and inner refinement that echoes many Sufi ideas, but it's uniquely expressed through Alevi tradition. In many Sufi orders, as well as in Alevism, Ali is venerated as the initiator into the mystical tradition. One saying of the Prophet Muhammad states, "I am the city of knowledge, and Ali is the gate." In other words, Muhammad reveals the exoteric, but it's Ali who interprets and brings the select few into the esoteric nature of revelation in his role as the custodian of the revelation of the Prophet. Alevism also links Ali with many natural forces. Alevi poetry equates Ali with the moon and Muhammad as the sun. Ali is also associated with the crane, an important bird throughout Central Asia which is interpreted as a kind of messenger. Ali is also sometimes called upon in times of distress with a special Arabic prayer called Nade Ali. The prayer is found not just in Alevism, but in the prayer books of Anatolian Sunni Sufis, like the Mevlevis. It says, "Call on Ali. He is able to bring about the extraordinary. You will find him an effective supporter in all calamities. All worries and sorrows will soon disappear by your greatness, O God, by your prophethood, O Muhammad, by your vice-regency, O Ali, O Ali, O Ali." And all of this, the nature imagery, the mystical symbolism, the deep cosmic role of Ali has led some to describe Alevism as Islamized shamanism, seeing in their practices and beliefs the survival of pre-Islamic Turkic religion within an Islamic framework. Now, we'll return to this interpretation in a bit, but for now I'll just note that not all Alevis would accept this portrayal, and historians tend to view Alevism as a tradition that emerged out of a medieval Islamic context in Anatolia, and not out of pre-Islamic shamanism. So if Alevis don't typically go to mosque or pray 5 times a day, what do they do? To understand Alevi practice in general, we need to rewind a few centuries to the rural villages of medieval Anatolia. Alevism is historically a rural tradition, centered around a unique social and religious structure called the ocak system, or the hearth system. This system is made up of sacred lineages tracing back to the 13th century, led by Deydes. And if you remember from earlier, Deydes claimed descent from key figures like Ali, his son Hussein, and the 12 Imams. These Ojak families form a kind of priestly caste and make up about 10% of the Alevi community. They're responsible for preserving and transmitting Alevi religious knowledge, which is passed down orally and through ritual practice. The rest of the community, or the talips, or disciples, are the laity, who receive spiritual guidance and social leadership from their affiliated Ojak. Tribal communities in Anatolia formed around these sacred lineages, and even today many Alevi villages remain tied to a specific Ojak lineage, with the expectation that the people living there will be initiated into Alevi traditions. Historically, Alevis were also endogamous, which means they primarily married within their own communities, and Alevi identity was inherited through birth and kinship. So for much of their history, being a Levi was not primarily about what you believe or what you practice, it was something you were born into, deeply rooted in kinship and lineage. Now, as I mentioned before, Alevism is largely an oral tradition, meaning that instead of relying on written scripture, its teachings have been passed down through poetry and music, transmitted by wandering bards named ashiks. They would travel from village to village and play a pivotal role alongside the Deydes in the most important ritual gathering in Alevism, called the gem ceremony, which I'll explain soon. Alevi poetry, known as nefes or deish, or breaths and sayings respectively, was and still is primarily communicated through music, played on a long-necked lute called a saz. Some Alevis even refer to the saz as the Quran with strings, because it accompanies the poems which convey the history, religious traditions, and theology of the Alevis in oral form. For instance, one nefes might recount the tragedy of the Battle of Karbala, naming Imam Hussein and his fallen companions, ending each verse with the refrain, Ali, the King of Men. Another nefes may praise the major saint Haji Bektash, or describe the soul's longing for unity with God. This musical tradition is one of the most recognizable aspects of Alevism, and its influence stretches far beyond Alevi communities. Alevi songs are widely known across religious and ethnic divides, and are now celebrated as an essential part of Turkish and Kurdish folk heritage. Some of the most respected musicians in Turkish folk music have strong connections to the Alevi tradition, even if they weren't Alevi themselves. The Sunni Muslim musician Ruhi Su, along with Ashok Veysel and Arif Sağ, are among the giants of Turkish folk music, who helped solidify Alevi music as a pillar of Turkish cultural identity. Many of these songs draw from Alevi poetry and spiritual themes, and remain some of the most cherished and widely performed pieces in Turkey today. The songs are deeply mystical. They're packed with layers of meaning reflecting traditional Alevi teachings. As we've already seen, these poems show a strong veneration of Ali and his descendants, the 12 Imams. For example, consider the song Bugün Bize Pir Geldi, Today the Pir Came to Us. The whole poem is a celebration and declaration of love and loyalty for Ali. That title, Pir, is akin to the word master, and literally means old man in Persian, and here it refers to Ali. Throughout the poem, he's referred to as Padishah and Sultan, both royal titles. His name is beautiful, O beautiful Shah, my Padishah, the creator. He reads from black and white. I will not turn my back from my peer. Even if 1,000 years may pass, I will not turn my back from my peer. This is one example of how Alevi poetry and song often explores the mystical path and Ali's role in it. There are also poems called Devriye, which tell sweeping cosmological stories, and Matem poems, somber laments mourning the suffering of Muhammad's family, especially Ali's son Hussein, who was martyred at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. Stories of suffering and martyrdom play a powerful role in Alevi religious life. Like many Shi'i and Ali-centric traditions in Islam, Alevis place special emphasis on the early Islamic figures who were persecuted or killed for their faith, like Ali and his son Hussein. These stories resonate deeply with Alevi's own experience of marginalization. And traditionally, they've eagerly awaited the messianic figure of the 12th Imam, the Mehdi, who will return to enact justice and liberate the oppressed. Each year, Alevis have traditionally marked the Islamic month of Muharram with a period of mourning and observe a fast that they break on the day of Ashura, the 10th day of Muharram, which commemorates the death of Hussein. And completely unique to the Alevis is the practice of musahiplik, or companionship. This ritual marks full initiation to the Alevi community and is based on two people forming a spiritual pact. It symbolically echoes the close bond between the Prophet Muhammad and Ali, representing both spiritual brotherhood and mutual responsibility. The pact is usually made by two men along with their wives, creating a kin-like relationship between the two families. From that point on, their kids are considered blood relatives and are forbidden from marrying each other. This form of ritual kinship is not practiced by related groups like the Bektashis, and appears to be a uniquely Alevi tradition. As I mentioned though, the heart of Alevi religious life is a communal gathering called the Aini Gem, the celebration of community, or just Gem for short. If you're confused by the spelling on screen, in Turkish the letter C is pronounced like the English J, so this word is pronounced gem. Traditionally, these take place at least once a year and follow a sequence of ritual dances, sacred songs, prayers, and religious messages led by a dede. After, the congregation shares a meal together. Historically, they were not held in a specialized religious building like a mosque, but rather in a home that would be set aside and dedicated for celebrating the gem. Today, though, meetings are often held in an assembly house called a gem evi. Ali, again, is central to the symbolism of the gem ceremony. This communal gathering is considered a symbolic reenactment of the Kirklar Gemi, the Gathering of the 40, a uniquely Alevi take on the Islamic story of the Prophet Muhammad's ascension into heaven, during which he's said to have encountered earlier prophets and received divine revelations. In Alevi accounts, when the Prophet traveled to heaven, he united with 39 prophets and saints, including Ali, who proceeded to lead the gathering. The dede leads the ceremony in the local language, Turkish or Kurdish, with prayers and hymns occasionally punctuated by Quranic phrases in Arabic. The gathering usually culminates in the sema, a circle dance that's said to symbolize unity with God, that shares its name with the more famous whirling dance of the Mevlevi order. Traditionally, 2 men and 2 women who are bound together through the Musahib-Leek relationship step onto the ritual space and dance with slow, deliberate steps. Later, the rhythm shifts, the ashik begins a new song, and a more energetic dance begins. The atmosphere becomes more celebratory. Men and women dance freely, turning and spinning in wider, more expressive movements. In the Alevi context, this part of the dance alludes to the climax of the primordial gem, when the prophets and saints are drawn into a state of ecstatic trance. As the anthropologist Dr. Shanklin reports from his fieldwork, the purpose of this second part of the dance is to leave the ceremony with joy and a renewed sense of unity, not just solemn reverence. Afterwards, everyone shares a communal meal, an extension of the gem ceremony that reinforces social bonds and affirms the collective nature of the Alevi community. And the gem ceremony does play a crucial social role, with the dede serving as both mediator and moral guide for the community. Before the ceremony begins, everyone's expected to be at peace with one another. This expectation is ritualized through an open invitation to raise any unresolved conflicts, helping to ensure that the community enters the ritual in both spiritual and social harmony. Alevis sometimes even draw a contrast between the gem and the mosque, pointing out that enemies might unknowingly pray by your side in a mosque while the gem ceremony requires reconciliation beforehand. The martyrdom of Ali, who was killed while praying in a mosque, is often invoked as a cautionary tale, highlighting how even sacred spaces can become sites of betrayal. Historically, the gem was closed to outsiders and reserved only for those who have undergone proper initiation. This secrecy often led to misunderstandings and fueled suspicion about Alevi practices, which in turn contributed to long-standing discrimination and marginalization. In recent decades, though, some Alevi communities have adopted a more open stance, occasionally allowing non-Alevis to observe or even film the ceremony. All of these elements highlight how Alevi worship is collective, embodied, and deeply rooted in everyday social life. So these are some of the key elements that make Alevis distinctly Alevis: the gem ceremony, mystical poetry and song, sacred lineages of the Ojak system, an esoteric approach to religion, and an elevated view of Ali. But how do these beliefs and practices emerge? Well, let's turn to Alevi history now. Alevism is actually a modern term. Before the 1900s, communities that identified with what we now call Alevism went by different names. The most common name was Kızılbaş, which literally means redhead. The term refers to the distinctive red headgear worn by disciples of the Safavid Sufi order, which we'll talk about soon, but it became a catch-all label and often a slur for rural, Ali-venerating tribal communities organized around hereditary spiritual lineages that we call the Ojak system. The Kızılbaş tradition took shape in the 15th and 16th centuries, but its roots go back earlier, emerging out of a complex matrix of mystical, millenarian, and tribal movements that populated Anatolia after the collapse of the Seljuk Empire in the late 13th century. In this period, Turkic-speaking nomads known as Turkmen migrated from Central Asia, bringing with them their own holy men, folk customs, and ecstatic forms of worship. And you've probably heard of one of the migrants from this era, the Sufi mystic and poet Rumi, who's known globally today. But for Alevis, the more central figure is Hacı Bektaş Veli, a 13th century Turkic-speaking holy man who settled in Anatolia around 1230 CE. Hacı Bektaş is a huge deal when it comes to the development of Alevism. In fact, among Turkish-speaking communities, he's often considered the most important saint, often calling him Pir or Master, and many Alevi Ojaks claim spiritual lineage from him or his disciples. Though unlike Rumi, he didn't leave behind a huge collection of poetry or writings for us to study. What we do have, though, is a hagiography, a saint's biography, and this thing is fantastic, in the sense of fantastical. Think dragons, shapeshifters, miracle working. Clearly, these stories struck a chord with a lot of different groups, because over time, many communities claimed Hacı Bektaş as their own, either as a blood ancestor or as a religious guide. His legacy also led to the formation of the Bektashi order, a Sufi brotherhood that blended Islamic mysticism with Turkic folk beliefs and reverence for Ali. Over time, these charismatic leaders gave rise to a complex religious landscape in medieval Anatolia. Wandering holy men called babas and abdals became a common sight, playing a huge role in shaping a kind of early proto-Alevi Bektashi spirituality among the Turkmen and Kurdish tribes across the region. Their teachings blurred the lines between Sunni, Shia, and Sufi Islam, mixing reverence for Ali and the 12 Imams with other folk traditions and the veneration of a whole roster of local saints and folk heroes that some scholars call the Alevi Bektashi pantheon, a diverse set of sacred personalities that includes not just figures from early Islam, but regional heroes and miracle workers whose tombs still draw pilgrims to this day. And pilgrimages to local shrines of Sufi and Alevi saints is still an important practice among Alevis. Historically, this included long journeys to major Shi'i shrines in places like Najaf and Karbala in present-day Iraq. But today, the most significant pilgrimage site for Alevis is the shrine of Haji Bektash located in central Turkey. Every fall, thousands gather here for a major annual festival. So in these early centuries of medieval Anatolia, religious identity was not neatly categorized. Many of the communities who venerated Ali and followed these wandering mystics may have officially identified as Sunni, but their actual practices and beliefs drew from a mix of Islamic mysticism, tribal customs, and popular devotion. Scholars describe this as a Sufi-Sunni Shi'i matrix, a kind of theological melting pot. So Alevism as we understand it today did not descend fully formed from a single founder or doctrine. It evolved organically from the lived religious world of medieval rural Anatolia through hereditary holy families and wandering dervishes who were transmitting esoteric teachings via music, poetry, and collective rituals, influenced by Sufi mysticism and local folk Islam. What really solidified a distinct Alevi identity, though, was an intense us versus them dynamic that emerged from a series of political movements and rebellions in medieval Anatolia. Now, we don't have time to get into all of them, but there was the Babai Revolt in 1240, which was a massive rebellion led by Turkmen dervishes and peasants against the Seljuk state. Then there was the Bedreddin Rebellion in the early 1400s, led by Sheikh Bedreddin, a former Ottoman judge who called for communal ownership and religious equality. But perhaps the most transformative movement was the rise of the Safavid movement in the 15th and 16th centuries. Originally a Sunni Sufi brotherhood with Kurdish roots, the Safaviya order gradually adopted an Ali-centric theology and a militant messianic vision. Under the leadership of Ismail I, this Sufi movement evolved into a major political force. In 1501, Ismail declared himself Shah of Iran and founded the Safavid Empire, officially adopting Twelver Shi'ism as the state religion. While consolidating power in Iran, Ismail also sent agents and missionaries back into Anatolia to rally support. His followers there, known as Qızılbaş, embraced this new Safavid identity and its revolutionary claims. Many of these tribes were already deeply immersed in esoteric Ali veneration and saintly devotion, but the Safavid cause gave those beliefs a sharper political edge and a target: the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were not having it. They crushed these uprisings and started to see the Qızılbaş as a seditious threat, labeling them as heretics and atheists who were endangering Islam. And so the Ottoman authorities began a policy of centralization and Sunni Islamification, forcibly relocating many Qızılbaş groups to fully assert imperial control from Constantinople. In response, the Qızılbaş retreated deeper into the Anatolian countryside, distancing themselves from the imperial core. This isolation, along with the persecution they faced from Ottoman authorities, became a defining part of Alevi cultural memory. Even today, many Alevis see their history as shaped by oppression and marginalization at the hands of the empire. Now, to be fair, the relationship between Alevis and the Ottomans is more nuanced, but many Alevis today, generally speaking, don't see themselves as part of the Ottoman cultural legacy in the same way a Turkish Sunni Muslim might. The one partial bridge between the imperial core and these peripheral communities was the Bektashi order, the Sufi brotherhood associated with Haji Bektash Veli. Historically, the term Qızılbaş referred more to the rural tribal followers of Safavid Shi'ism, and Bektashi referred to members of the Bektashi Sufi order. In practice, though, Alevi and Bektashi beliefs heavily overlapped. Both revered Ali and Haji Bektash, and both were labeled heterodox by the Sunni establishment. Modern scholarship suggests that both of these groups emerged from a common pool of Anatolian folk Islam, and they can be seen as distinctive streams branching out of medieval Anatolian Sufism. The Alevis were the decentralized tribal worshippers following local deities, while Bektashism provided a more centralized Sufi order framework. And for centuries, Alevis remained on the margins of Ottoman life, rural, oral, and largely invisible in official records. That is, until the mid-19th century, when they were suddenly, quote-unquote, rediscovered by Western academics, Christian missionaries, and later, Turkish nationalist historians, all of whom had their own ideas about who the Alevis were and what their place in Turkish history should be. When Christian missionaries started traveling through Anatolia in the 19th century, many were convinced that Alevis had some kind of hidden Christian origin, even though there was no actual historical link between the two. One of their favorite theories was that Alevis worshipped a kind of quasi-trinity, because they often invoked God, Muhammad, and Ali together. In 1858, one American missionary wrote, "I am satisfied first that they are descendants from a Christian stock, made nominal Muslims by the sword. For although they are called Muslims, and in the presence of Turks declare themselves such, they have no sympathy with them, but on the contrary feel a deep hostility toward them. They do not receive the Quran nor Muhammad as a prophet from God, but they do receive the gospel and Christ, usually under the name of Ali, as the Son of God." Now, these claims about Alevi Christian connections were based on some serious misunderstandings of Muslim practices, and while the missionaries' theories did not have a lasting impact, another so-called discovery did. In the late Ottoman period, early Turkish nationalist historians set out to trace, or in some cases invent, a direct line from the ancient pre-Islamic Turks to contemporary Turkish identity that included the Alevis. To make this supposed connection work, they argued that Alevis were not just a branch of Islam, but rather the modern heirs of pre-Islamic Turkic shamanism. The most influential figure in shaping this modern understanding was the historian Mehmed Fuad Kuprulu. He proposed a sweeping genealogy that traced Alevis back to Central Asian shamanism. For example, consider how he described the Babai dervishes, who played a major role in the religious landscape of 13th and 14th century Anatolia. The Islam of these Turkmen is not like the totally orthodox Islam of the urbanized Turks, but a syncretism resulting from the blending of the ancient heathen customs of the old Turks and a simple and popular form of an extremist Shiism, outwardly cloaked in the mantle of Sufism and some local remnants. This interpretation dovetailed nicely with the Turkish nationalist agenda. Nationalist historians working within this framework saw Alevism not just as a heterodox branch of Islam, but as a living survival of ancient Turkic spirituality with a Islamic veneer just pasted on the top. They drew connections between shamanic drum rituals and the music used in Alevi gem ceremonies, and even reimagined the Dede as a kind of Islamized shaman. Now, to be clear, this interpretation is widely rejected by scholars. It oversimplifies the complex and multivalent influences that shaped Alevism in medieval Anatolia, especially its deep roots in Islamic mysticism and Sufi practice. Take, for example, the popular claim that Alevi ashuks, the wandering bards who transmit poetry and religious teachings, are descendants of Central Asian shamans. Scholars such as Ilhan Bashkoz have pushed back against this idea, arguing that the parallels drawn between shamans and ashuks are largely superficial and not supported by the evidence. The appeal of such theories has more to do with the ideological priorities of early 20th century Turkish nationalism, which aimed to construct a continuous, distinctly Turkish cultural identity. In doing so, it often downplayed or distorted the Islamic dimensions of Alevism to fit a secular nationalist narrative. Still, this reframing marked an unexpected positive shift for the Alevis. Instead of being marginalized, they were now the guardians of an authentic Turkish identity, celebrated for preserving the Turkish language and resisting outside influences. The nationalist historian Baha Said even argued that the use of simple Turkish in Alevi and Bektashi ceremonies served as a defense against what he called Arab internationalism. He wrote the internationalist ideal of the Arabs could not be reconciliated with the national ideal of the Turks. Now, this Turkic-centered view of Alevism was naturally appealing to Turkish-speaking communities, but it completely overlooked Kurdish Alevis. In fact, both Kurdish Alevis and their Sunni counterparts soon found themselves erased from the national historical narrative. Interestingly, the narratives of Kurdish Alevis also emphasize pre-Islamic influences, but specifically pre-Islamic Iranian influences. For example, consider how an Alevi news service presents Kurdish Alevism. Kurdish Alevism is a belief that carries Zoroastrian elements. The fact that Kurdish Alevis sanctify the 12 Imams and Imam Ali is a kind of protective instinct that developed because of Islamic oppression. The old religion of the Kurds is a reality that comes from Zoroastrianism. Alevism still lives with all its vitality on the cultural values of the Kurdish people that go back to the depths of history. Now again, historians are critical of this narrative, but it's an interesting example of a strategic response to state-sponsored efforts to frame Alevism solely through a Turkish nationalist lens. By emphasizing pre-Islamic Iranian elements, some Kurdish Alevis assert a distinct ethno-religious identity that resists both Sunni Islam and Turkish cultural assimilation. This framing serves as a kind of counterclaim of authenticity, one that grounds Kurdish Alevism in an ancient indigenous heritage and recenters Kurdish identity within the story of Alevism itself. Though again, historians locate the origins of Alevism to the networks of various Sufi institutions and dervish lodges in medieval and early modern Anatolia. These competing narratives, whether nationalist, religious, or based on ethnicity, highlight just how contested and flexible Alevi identity has become over time. But debates over identity are only part of the story. Over the course of the 1900s, Alevism itself underwent some pretty dramatic transformations, not just in how it was understood, but in how it was practiced and lived. This all started with the establishment of the Turkish Republic. Remember that Alevism emerged out of rural Anatolian village life. Alevis had their own distinct social order, often organized around village communities under the Ocak system. But the rise of modern Turkey, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, flipped that world upside down. The fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I ended centuries of Islamic imperial rule, and Ataturk aimed to replace it with a secular, centralized nation-state. Ataturk abolished the caliphate, dissolved religious courts, closed down Sufi lodges, and banned many forms of public religious expression. His reforms aimed to suppress the political power of religion altogether, creating a modern, secular Turkish identity rooted in nationalism rather than Islam. Today, many Alevis, and especially ethnic Turkish Alevis, look back on Ataturk with deep admiration and are often fervent Kemalists, as in they support the political ideology built on Ataturk's ideas, including secularism and society. Some even go so far as to call him some kind of messianic figure. The journalist and artist Ali Tashkent Balaban once wrote, "There's a passion for Ataturk among Alevis that is hard to describe. They've expressed their belief in him to the extent of saying that the Mahdi is Ataturk." That strong connection with Ataturk and Kemalism, though, didn't just appear overnight. It developed over time as a reaction to the growing role of political Islam in Turkey. Back in the early years of the Republic, which was founded in 1923, Alevis were still holding an ambiguous position in society, kind of like they were under the Ottomans. Not fully accepted and not fully excluded. The government was pushing hard for secularism, sure, but at the same time it was trying to build a single, unified national identity. One of the main tools that the state used was the Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs. It's still around today. Basically, it's a state-run body overseeing all official Islamic institutions in Turkey. It manages the mosques, appoints the imams, and even writes the Friday sermons. But the Diyanet only supported Sunni interpretations of Islam. Alevism wasn't even on the radar. Neither recognized nor regulated. It was just invisible. Starting in the mid-1900s, many Alevis started moving to the cities, looking for better schools and opportunities. But this shift had a major side effect. It eroded the tight-knit village communities that had long been the heart of Alevi life. Things like the communal rituals, the Ocak system, guidance by the Dedes just all started to fray in the shift to urban life. By the 1960s, a new generation of urban Alevis was coming of age, and many of them got swept up in the political energy of the time. A lot of young Alevis were drawn to Marxist and leftist movements, which were gaining traction across Turkey. And at least in the public eye, Alevis became linked with the broader leftist opposition to the Turkish government. As political violence escalated in the 1970s, the state started cracking down on leftist groups. Then came a military coup in 1980, after which a new ideology was promoted by the military-installed government. It was basically a Turkish Islamic synthesis that allowed Sunni Islam a greater role as part of Turkish ethnic identity. Alevi history is also marked by several violent incidents that have left deep scars on the community. The most infamous of these is the Sivas massacre in 1993. A group of Alevis gathered in the city of Sivas for a cultural festival honoring Pir Sultan Abdal, a beloved Alevi poet and saint. Among the guests was Aziz Nesin, a leftist writer who had recently sparked outrage for trying to publish a Turkish translation of the Satanic Verses. A mob of Islamist protesters surrounded the building and set it on fire, while the security forces stood by. 35 people were killed in the blaze. Not all the flashpoints are violent, but they're still seen by the Alevi community as symbolically and deliberately provocative. One high-profile example came in 2013, when the Turkish government named the Third Bosphorus Bridge after Sultan Selim I, the Ottoman ruler who defeated the Safavids in 1514. For many Alevis, Selim I represents the beginning of centuries of state-backed persecution, and the fact that Alevis were neither consulted nor considered in the naming of the bridge struck many as a deliberate provocation. That same year, Alevis showed up in large numbers during the Gezi Park protests, a broad tent movement against growing authoritarianism in Turkey. Despite this marginalization, or maybe because of it, a kind of cultural awakening arose during the course of the 1900s and early 2000s. Alevis started actively exploring and articulating Alevi identity in public, as distinct from Sunni Islam. First, they started building dedicated community centers called cemevis. Part ritual space, part cultural hub, and often open to the public, these became places to perform Alevi ceremonies, as well as places to gather, organize, and celebrate their identity. Alevi-run TV channels and radio stations also popped up, and books and publications began to circulate that for the first time openly described Alevi practices that had once been kept secret. So over the course of the 1900s into the early 2000s, Alevism transformed from a largely invisible, often misunderstood tradition into one that suddenly became publicly accessible. You can now visit a cemevi like you would visit a mosque or a church, or even watch an Alevi gem ceremony on national television. But even as Alevis became more visible in public life, there was and still is a lot of debate within the community about what it means to be a Alevi. Is it a branch of Islam, a cultural identity, a distinct religion altogether? There is still no clear consensus. Some Alevis do describe it as a separate sect of Islam, alongside Sunnism or Shiism. One of the most influential groups holding to this view is the Jem Vakfa, or Jem Foundation. They run Alevi TV and radio stations and publish educational material trying to define Alevi identity. They take the position that Alevism is the spiritual expression of an ancient native Turkish religiosity, something deeply rooted in Turkish history, but articulated through an Islamic framework. They argue it's a version of Islam that's uniquely suited to the Turkish people. Here's how they put it in one of their primers. Alevism, which believes in the existence of Allah, the Holy Quran, and all the prophets mentioned in it, is a Turkmen interpretation. It is the path followed by the Haji Bektash Veli and many lovers of truth. Those who confess this path are called Alevis. This version of Alevism really emphasizes the links to Islam, highlighting its ties to key Islamic figures, beliefs, and the Quran. Others, like the Pir Sultan Abdel Cultural Associates USA, describe Alevism not as a sect of Islam, but as a way of life, a universal philosophy rooted in mysticism, ethics, and cultural memory. Their framing creates more distance between Alevism and Islamic orthodoxy. In fact, the primer on their website doesn't mention the Quran at all, and only references Islam twice, and even then only to make a point to differentiate themselves from normative definitions of Islam. Their primer reads, Alevis are clearly set apart from Shi'is and from mainstream Islam in general, by the heavy doses of mysticism that mark their belief system, which bears an affinity with Sufism and a number of pre-Islamic mystical traditions. The adjective Turkish also appears nowhere. Their definition of Alevism leans more into the universalist and Sufi interpretations of the tradition, saying in Alevism, every human being is a carrier of the essence from God. If God created all living things, then the human being is the most sacred. They also emphasize a progressive interpretation of Alevism, saying that Alevis call each other John, a gender-neutral title. As a result of this understanding, the position of women in Alevism is equal to men. So while some groups frame Alevism as a distinctly Turkish expression of Islam, others highlight its mystical and humanistic character, arguing it's a universal way of life. And beyond those big picture interpretations, a few other movements have popped up in recent decades. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, for example, a small group of Alevis began leaning more heavily into Shiism. They argue that most modern Alevis have drifted away from what they see as the true faith, claiming that groups like the Bektashi order introduced too many outside influences. This group takes a much more traditional Shi'i approach to practice. They even built a Shi'i-style mosque in the city of Çorum, and their rituals and worship look almost identical to what you'd see in 12-verse Shi'ism. On the other end of the spectrum, especially within the Turkish diaspora in Europe, a different offshoot has gained traction, called Ali's Alevi League, literally Alevism without Ali. This movement rejects any connection to Islam altogether and downplays the Sufi elements found in traditional Alevi practice. Instead, it looks back to a speculative pre-Islamic past, claiming that any apparent connection to Islam was tacked on later and is not really part of Alevism. These diaspora communities in Europe have emphasized Alevism's distinctiveness from Islam, often embracing a more loosely defined identity, one that centers on simply self-identifying as Alevi and recognizing the gem ceremony as the primary form of worship. Following this strategy, these diaspora communities successfully advocated for Alevism being considered as an entirely separate religion. In a document organized by the AABF, the largest Alevi federation in Germany, the organization draws a clear line between their vision of Alevism and those Alevis who still identify as Muslim. They see this dual identification, as both Muslim and Alevi at the same time, as not a reflection of Alevi's true essence, but as a response to centuries of religious pressure and marginalization. They write the self-image of calling themselves both Alevi and Muslim is found among some Alevis, and can be seen at least in part as a result of the Sunni assimilation policy. Alevis in this group are always on the defensive against Sunnis, and try to explain and justify their faith using Sunni arguments. In other words, the AABF is arguing that identifying as both Alevi and Muslim is often a survival strategy, not a theological conviction. These views spark backlash from both sides. On one side, many Alevis who see themselves as part of Islam reject the idea that Alevism should be treated as something entirely separate. On the other hand, Sunni Muslims frequently accuse Alevis of being fringe, heretical, or even atheistic. So a form of Alevism that emphasizes secular and humanist values is especially vulnerable to this sort of criticism, as they're easily portrayed by Sunni detractors as having abandoned Islam altogether. In 2014, Turkey's then Prime Minister Erdogan directly criticized these movements, saying in Germany there is something like Alevism without Ali. In other words, there is an atheist understanding, a structure that they support under the guise of Alevism. Erdogan was responding to a theory articulated by the Kurdish journalist Faik Bulut, who argued that the Islamic elements in Alevism don't actually reflect anything concretely Islamic. According to this framing, these elements are just surface-level features that mask what is at its core a non-Islamic belief system. Now, to be clear, the AABF doesn't really subscribe to this exact theory. In fact, it tends to avoid strict definitions altogether. But it's easy to see how its deliberate distancing from Islam and its push to define Alevism as a separate tradition altogether has made it an easy target for critics like Erdogan, who frame such movements as either misguided or outright atheistic. Today, Alevism sits at the crossroads of some of the most pressing issues in Turkey: the polarized politics of Islamism versus secularism, Kurdish politics, the fallout from the Syrian civil war, and the increasingly complex relationship between Turkey and its diaspora communities. Alevi responses have been very diverse, which is not particularly surprising considering that Alevis have never been a unified or monolithic group. The traditional hierarchy that once structured Alevi religious life has largely faded, and in its place, new models are starting to emerge. In the diaspora, especially in countries like Germany or Austria, we're starting to see the formation of formal theological institutions, designed to train a new generation of Alevi leaders. These efforts borrow from European models of church-state relations and religious education, raising the question, could this mark the beginning of a new era for Alevism? Will this lead to a more homogeneous identity? Alevism offers a powerful case study of how fluid and contemporary religious identity can be. A tradition may have a centuries-long history, but that doesn't mean its boundaries are fixed. The neat categories of Sunni, Shi'i, Muslim, non-Muslim that we often reach for don't always apply so cleanly. So looking closely at the Alevis doesn't just reveal how complex they are as a community, it forces us to rethink how we understand Islam or religion as a whole.
And like any living tradition, it raises bigger questions. Who defines a religion? Who controls its public image, and whose voices get amplified? Those same questions apply to how we consume news today, which is why I use today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. They aggregate stories from a bunch of different media outlets and pair those stories with a quick visual breakdown on the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting. For example, let's consider the story about how the U.S. Federal Communications Commission just approved an $8 billion merger between media giants Skydance and Paramount. In a statement, the FCC chairman said that the agency had approved the deal after receiving assurances that the company would not establish programs related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here, Ground News has aggregated hundreds of news sources covering the story. Right down here, we can see the bias distribution chart. Most of the coverage is coming from centrist sources, followed by left-leaning and a minority from right-leaning sources. Scroll down again and you can see the factuality rating. Here we see the vast majority of these sources are considered highly factual. And at the bottom is the ownership chart. Most of these sources are owned by media conglomerates, followed by private equity and wealthy private owners. Ground News also enables you to easily compare the headlines to see how different outlets are framing the story. On the left, The Verge explicitly mentions that the Paramount-Skydance merger was approved after the companies agreed to government speech demands, while the right-wing outlet Newsmax simply says that the FCC approved the deal without extra detail. Another useful feature is the blank spot feed, which highlights stories that are being covered predominantly by one side of the political spectrum. Some of these headlines show up in just 10% or less of right or left-leaning outlets, meaning entire audiences might not see them at all. If you'd like to give it a try, Ground News is giving viewers 40% off their Vantage plan. Go to ground.news/religion for breakfast or click the link in the description below to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.